Masarase Muriye, Zimbabwe, and thank you for joining us on NehandaTV. We are honored today to have the Minister of Tourism, Mr. Walter Mzembi. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lance. Good afternoon, fellow Zimbabweans.
The last time President Mugabe made one of his rather infamous speeches, he said, and I quote, "Blair, keep your England and I'll keep my Zimbabwe." The question that arises, what is a government minister from Mr. Mugabe's cabinet doing in the UK?
Well, we have maintained tourism as the bridge that would connect people to people. It is the people-to-people diplomatic bridge, which we all agreed even when we were at the height of our disjuncture, that it would be maintained to allow the people of the world to walk back and forth, to begin to connect in the manner that they are doing, and we refer to it as citizenship diplomacy. Tourism is a peace sector, and it is not sucked into disjunctures that may take place from time to time between nation states. So that's why I'm here. I'm here by his express mandate and permission to engage at people-to-people level.
You rather seem unsure about what sort of relationship you want with the West. One moment you are abusing them, one moment you are trying to encourage them to invest in the country. Are you ever going to make up your mind?
They have been abusing us in the last 14 years. We never sought disengagement in the first instance. We did what we believed was right for Zimbabwe, and that is to acquire our land and impress and authenticate our sovereignty as a nation state for a resource that we all went to struggle for. In fact, land and universal franchise were the two struggles that we really put into focus during the Liberation War. And to the extent that the unfinished business of land became the disjuncture between us and the West, the United States included, we then sought to say that if it was that which was going to separate us, so be it. But I'm happy to report that even after the unilateral action of Europe, they've provided themselves a ladder, climbed down on it, and revoked Article 96 of the ACP-EU Cotonou Agreement. And they've revoked it basically to begin to equalize the situation. And on the back of that, you recently saw a British delegation coming into Zimbabwe for a scoping mission on business opportunities in the country. So they basically climbed down. Yeah.
Okay. Your party is in the throes of serious factional fighting. We've seen violence break out in Harare South and Marondera, amongst other areas. There is an accusation that people in your party are focusing more on the factional fighting rather than dealing with the pertinent issues that affect the ordinary person. How do you respond to that allegation?
I belong to that party. If that logic was correct, I wouldn't be here. I had a whole economic pillar called tourism. And to the extent that I'm here...
Well, you are here, but in the weeks prior to this, everyone was moving around with the First Lady. Government business was abandoned, and everyone was moving with the First Lady.
It's not correct. If everyone was moving with the First Lady, then we would have seen a caravan of 14 million people. There were
government ministers, I mean.
Not all of them. Those that had obviously business with what was happening were actually in the retinue of the First Lady. But the majority of government ministers were at work, and that includes me. I'm here, I'm at work, with the express permission of President Mugabe to engage the tourism market. Yeah.
But hasn't the factional fighting somehow disrupted government business? Your eye is surely off the ball, because we are having people putting more energy into organizing demonstrations against the vice president rather than...
Ordinarily, it shouldn't, because we should budget for those periods, those seasons. Politics is seasons too. And the season leading up to a convention or a congress is characterized by the kind of noise that you capture now. It's characterized by gladiation, when contesting parties for political power basically position themselves. But it should
but people don't beat each other up like what happened in Harare South and Marondera, should they?
That would border on criminality, and there's a whole police force to deal with that. If people express themselves violently in a country where we've agreed that going forward we have zero tolerance to violence, then the police must come in and act accordingly. Otherwise, we don't want anyone's political ambitions to be expressed through violence, as it were.
You talking about free expression, people demonstrating, and you are here in the UK ostensibly to encourage people to visit Zimbabwe. Just yesterday, we had journalist and activist Itai Dzamara savagely assaulted by police. What message does that send to aspiring tourists?
Ordinarily, it wouldn't send a correct message to any destination, but I'm not yet familiar with the facts surrounding what you are describing at this juncture. But we deplore violence from whatever quarter it takes place.
It does seem only ZANU-PF supporters are allowed to demonstrate.
Violence is something that we agreed even when we were consummating the national constitution, that would work assiduously to promote a violence-free society. And then President Mugabe then and his two gladiating fellas then, Morgan Tsvangirai, Welshman and others, they spoke at great length against violence. In fact, to the extent where the state itself declared zero tolerance to violence. So anybody practicing it from whatever quarter, and this court must be brought to book.
Is it not bizarre, though, that only people from your party are allowed to demonstrate?
Well, the people from everywhere else demonstrated recently with the demo by the MDC. And the political activity that is taking place in the country does not limit itself
they demonstrate, but they get assaulted.
Yeah, it doesn't limit itself to one party.
Yeah, but they demonstrate, but they get assaulted.
If there's anybody who has been assaulted, and has been assaulted to the extent where evidence can be presented, evidence can still also be presented against police officers if they misdirect themselves.
Okay.
So we declared zero tolerance to violence as the state. It doesn't matter who is committing.
This is in principle, but not in practice.
It doesn't matter.
Let's quickly move on. Your job as tourism minister is clearly a difficult one. At times, it appears you are carrying water using a leaking bucket because of the state of the nation. But some have accused you of living in a parallel universe, coming up with grandiose ideas that are not grounded in reality. You talk about Disneyland in Victoria Falls, and yet people want clean drinking water. They want a regular supply of electricity. How do you respond to that?
I take responsibility at collective level for the provision of water and electricity. However, that should not arrest my own vision for the tourism sector. It should not store what we have planned for the people of Zimbabwe within the tourism sector. So provision of water, electricity, roads, infrastructure, ICT are enabler actions to tourism. You can see here that tourism is happening on the back of the competence and efficiency of all service providers that include water and electricity. And to the extent that we can commit ourselves, as we have done as a collective, that by year 2020, we shall have a 5,000 megawatt energy source to the country, to an extent where we'll be a net exporter of electricity, then that will enable the actions of tourism. But when you fix energy, you have fixed water, you have fixed irrigation development, you have fixed reticulation of water potability into homes. And I will obviously not allow enabler actions to arrest what I...
But why talk about big things when you're failing to do the small things?
Because it's big things that make the small things happen.
Okay.
If you want to live longer, you must dream bigger than your size.
You keep talking about sanctions in all the interviews that you've done.
Yes, it's a fundamental issue.
I would like to quote for you somebody who is in your own government at the present moment. The current information minister, Jonathan Moyo, in May 2006 said, and I quote, despite spirited attempts to attribute the present economic turmoil to the so-called illegal sanctions, all available indications suggest that the sanctions issue is indeed nothing but propaganda. He further says, yet Mugabe and Murerwa, who was finance minister at the time, understand that the sanctions talk is pure ZANU-PF propaganda for mobilizing political support from the masses by seeking to make them believe that their suffering is due to economic sanctions imposed by imperialist foreigners. This is now a minister in your own government, information minister.
It was Jonathan Moyo before his Damascus moment, because 6 years later, he was the same Jonathan that eventually captured the manifesto for ZANU-PF, which placed theoretically a $42 billion bill on the EU. I am putting it at about 100 billion in terms of the cost of sanctions on the Zimbabwe.
Is it hard for you to accept he was telling the truth? This is someone who was out of favor, calling it as it's not someone on the feeding trough and benefiting from patronage.
It is easier for me to accept his Damascus moment, which is also put in writing to say that the cost of sanctions on the Zimbabwean economy runs in excess of 42 billion. I am putting it at 100 billion.
Okay, a more authoritative source, former finance minister, Simba Makod. He says, what sanctions? The travel ban on President Mugabe, the freezing of assets, whatever they are. Do you know that today all the platinum we are producing is being sold to the West? About 70% of the tobacco that we produce is being sold to Philip Morris and other Western countries. The little horticulture products that we still can produce are going to Amsterdam.
Even at the height of UDI sanctions, the markets for these products was still the same. It has never changed. It's busting. That's what we call sanctions busting.
There's no sanctions busting there. You were selling these products.
When you are able to sell to enemy markets or detractor markets, and you are still able to get your product there, you are busting. That's basically the simple definition of trade in that regard.
It's argued these sanctions are targeted. They were targeting members of the ruling inner circle. So how do you argue that they affect the country?
They are targeted and they are also omnipresent to the extent that if you read Zidera today, it limits all American citizens from engaging the country in multilateral and bilateral organizations as long as they are dealing on the other side of the divide with Zimbabwe. So they are very, very omnipresent. The withdrawal of European development funding for Zimbabwe is certainly not targeted. It took away this funding and put 2 billion euro into the hands of non-governmental organizations, avoiding direct budgetary support to the government of Zimbabwe. And I can tell you, those were funds that have gone largely unaccounted for. And this is why the European Union in itself has seen that it is better to deal with the government that you can hold to account. Because 80% of those 2 billion euros in the last decade went to consumptive expenditure.
One issue that has affected the economy has been the lack of clarity on the indigenization policy or the controversy surrounding it. Your definition of indigenous seems to be racist. If you are black, you are indigenous. If you are white, you are not indigenous. And yet there are whites who were born in Zimbabwe. How do you reconcile that?
Previously, it angers itself in definition to previously marginalized, dispossessed, and discriminated persons. And there is no white person in Zimbabwe who falls into that category, by the way. So it then limits itself to black people. But going forward,
every white person in Zimbabwe is privileged?
They were privileged. If they have run into circumstances today that seem to suggest that they've gone poorer, it doesn't take the definition away.
Okay. You are considered somewhat of a moderate in ZANU-PF. President Mugabe has described you as one of his best ministers in his cabinet. We ran a poll over possible successors in ZANU-PF, and I think you only came second to Maimjur on Nehanda Radio. We polled our readers. Have you considered running for the presidency sometime in the future?
It is every politician's ambition to one day end up there. And if there's any politician who tells you otherwise, he's not being honest, one with his constituency and with himself. So we all aspire, it's just like a class teacher. He aspires to be a headmaster one day. So that is the horizon. That is basically the ceiling as we see it. And the dashboard speaks to people ending up in the highest office. Okay. So yes, one day, if offered the opportunity, I will gladly consider it.
My final question, since we seem to be running out of time. We talked about majoring in minors and minoring in majors. Some say Zimbabwe has a crisis of legitimacy. They point to the controversy over the election last year and argue that unless the crisis of legitimacy is resolved, moving forward is going to prove difficult because nobody wants to invest in an uncertain political terrain.
Well, it would obviously be dealt with in the context of the revocation of Article 96. of the ACP-EU Cotonou Agreement. You don't remove a caveat on a government that you are not recognizing. So to the extent that the EU has said we are dispensing with Article 96, they are dispensing with it on a government that they previously sanctioned, meaning that they are now recognizing it and therefore endorsed it. But even post-election in Zimbabwe, we have received the endorsement of the United Nations through a current UN Secretary General and 2 retirees. We have received the endorsement of the rest of the world except the United Kingdom, who have actually provided themselves with a climb down ladder through the recent expedition.
So who has climbed down? The West and not you?
Certainly, they have something that they see in us that they feel they are now losing out on. It's like in Shona, you talk about Fimbi. If somebody is about to discover your Fimbi, you rush to make sure that you protect it. And these people here, the British, the Americans, and everybody else, have so much information on our resource endowment to the extent where they are beginning to feel the heat of competition from other emerging
But do you not think for people who are moving around with a begging bowl, you sound rather pompous?
I'm pompous to the extent that I actually want to place an invoice on the EU on the cost of sanctions, the opportunity cost. That has resulted
the sanctions which were described by Jonathan Moore as mere propaganda.
That has resulted even in our own diaspora, 3-4 million people. If you begin to cost the impact of our citizens in this economy, just the day before yesterday, the British computed 2 billion euros or pounds, for that matter, as the impact of European immigration on their own economy.
But not everyone in the diaspora is there because of economic circumstances. Some of them were bludgeoned and left the country fleeing political violence. So it's not fair to blanket everyone, would it be?
The tragedy is that the system here, the establishment, has not computed the impact of African immigration, notwithstanding the reasons, on their own economy. So you are not here valueless. You have an extreme...
It sounds rather hypocritical to create a political situation that makes people flee and then start blaming the countries where those people have fled to.
There are various reasons why people are here, some economic, some political. But on the balance of things, I think people pursue economic interests, they pursue economic life, and they got it better here, but it doesn't stop them from coming back home to even invest and do what they are supposed to do as citizens. They are welcome, and that's why I'm here. Part of my visit here is an extension of an olive branch to the diaspora to begin to say that we don't want future delegations coming from here without being carried by our children. British expertise cannot come to Zimbabwe without you. Otherwise, what is your value here in the last 14 years if they still feel that they can come back without their black Zimbabwean partners?
Okay.
Yeah.
Tourism Minister Walter Mzembi, thank you for joining us on Nehanda TV.